There are things you cannot buy back once they are gone. Adrian Cale had bought back most things. The waterfront holdings after the receivership, his seat at the table after 3 rivals tested him last spring and did not recover from the experience. But what he could not buy back was his own body's willingness to accept a meal. The blast had been 6 months ago, a car bomb, small and precise, planted by a man who understood that killing Cale directly was impossible and had decided to damage the machine instead. The bomber was dead within the week. The damage lived on. The explosion had rewired something in Cale's nervous system, flipped some switch in his skull that made anything rich, anything heavy with fat or cream or the deep iron smell of good meat, trigger a nausea so immediate and so absolute that he had stopped trying. He survived on black coffee, room temperature water, and occasional half slices of plain bread that his body accepted and then quietly forgot. His suits, tailored in January, no longer fit. His men noticed. They said nothing. Men who valued their continued existence did not point out that the boss was wasting away. The Empire noticed differently. Eastern syndicates had started testing the port routes again. Tribute that used to arrive Tuesdays had begun arriving Thursdays, then not at all. When you survive by projecting weight and certainty, losing 20 pounds in 6 months is not a personal matter. It is a balance sheet problem, and Cale thought in balance sheets. Holt managed the silence around it. He had worked for Cale for 11 years and understood that a frightened king is more dangerous than a healthy one, and that managing the fear required saying nothing and watching everything. Fiona Reid knew none of this. What she knew was Halifax in November, which was cold enough to make poverty feel like a personal conviction. She knew the particular silence of an empty office building at 2 in the morning, the way fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that settled behind your eyes. She knew split pea soup made from a leftover ham bone and a bag of dried peas that had been sitting in her cupboard since September, decanted into a steel thermos and carried to work because the vending machine in the lobby charged $3 for a bag of pretzels, and she was not paying $3 for a bag of pretzels. She had been a forensic accountant before she wasn't. 2 years at Alderman Whitfeld and Crane, the kind of firm that took in files with 3 sets of books and a handshake understanding that you would see only one of them. She had been very good at it. Good enough that 14 months ago she had noticed a structural error in a client's subsidiary accounts, specific, carefully placed, designed to survive a standard CRA audit and nothing beyond that. She had filed an internal report. Her supervisor had thanked her and forwarded it to the client. The client had sent it back with a name in the margin, a name she hadn't recognized then, and Alderman Whitfeld and Crane had let her go within the week. Whistleblowing protections existed in legislation. In practice, they existed in the same category as good intentions. Now she did overnight data entry 3 nights a week and weekend cleaning shifts. The data entry was for a company called Harrow Atlantic Investments, 15 floors up in a glass tower near the waterfront, which appeared to be a perfectly legitimate mid-size financial services firm. Fiona was not naive. She kept her eyes on her own screen. Except that on a Wednesday night in the 2nd week of November, at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning, she found it again. The same structural accounting error. The same deliberate mismatch between 2 subsidiary ledgers, built to pass a standard audit and explode under a forensic one. Same construction, different firm. Someone had made this mistake twice, or someone had placed it twice. She should have closed the file. She didn't. She pulled the associated records, opened her paper notebook, and started mapping the discrepancy. She was 3 pages in and 40 minutes deep, when the office lights came on at full intensity, and a very large man in a grey suit was standing in the doorway looking at her with the expression of someone who had expected nothing and found a problem. "The cleaning crew doesn't use the file room," he said. Fiona calculated the distance to the stairwell. It was not in her favor. "I found something," she said, "in the accounts." His name was Holt. She learned that later. What she understood immediately was that he did not shout, did not touch her, and did not ask her to explain again. He stood in the doorway and waited. That was somehow worse than shouting. "There's a discrepancy," Fiona said. She kept her voice level, which took effort and which she refused to show. "In the subsidiary ledger for the Meredith Cove holding, someone has split an asset line in a way that's invisible in a standard audit. If the CRA sends a forensic team, and someone may have already tipped them to do exactly that, it opens a liability that flags every associated account. I've seen this construction before." Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the thermos sitting beside her notebook. "What's in that?" Fiona blinked. "Split pea soup." He was on his phone before she finished the sentence. Cale arrived at 20 minutes to 3. She had expected someone who looked like authority. He was imposing, but not in the way she'd imagined. He was tall and had gone lean in a way that looked less like fitness and more like attrition, the kind of lean that comes from the body consuming itself. White scars traced the left side of his jaw and disappeared into his collar. His suit was impeccable and very slightly too large for him, the way a garment fits a man who has recently lost weight and not yet corrected for it. His eyes were grey and extremely precise, the eyes of a man who processed everything and assigned it a value. He looked at her, he looked at the open ledger, he looked at the thermos. Holt explained. Cale listened without interrupting. When Holt finished, Cale walked to the table, turned the ledger toward himself, and read in complete silence 4 minutes. Fiona counted. "You found this doing data entry," he said. "I recognized the construction. I'd seen it used before in a different context." "Who showed you how to read it?" "No one. I taught myself, working the file that got me fired." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, the Alderman Whitfeld matter. She went cold. "You know about that." "I know about most things in this city that affect my interests." He set the ledger down. "You were removed because you were accurate, not because you were wrong." There was nothing to say to that, so she said nothing. Cale looked at the thermos again. She had no explanation for why he kept looking at it. "May I?" he said. She uncapped the thermos and poured some into the lid, which doubled as a cup. She slid it across the table. He picked it up, held it close, and breathed in through his nose slowly, as if waiting for something to happen. Whatever he was waiting for didn't come. He took a sip. He set the cup down. He looked at the harbor lights through the dark window, and the expression on his face was not one she had a word for. It was something prior to relief, something that had stopped believing relief was possible. "Tell me the rest," he said, quieter now. She told him. She walked him through her notebook, the construction of the discrepancy, who had access, what timeline would be needed to plant the error and tip the CRA without triggering suspicion. 22 minutes. He asked 4 questions, all of them precise, none of them wasted. When she finished, he looked at Holt. "Find Driscoll's accountant." Holt left. Cale looked at Fiona. "You're done cleaning offices." "I need the income." "You'll be compensated, adequately." "I need to know what I'm agreeing to," she said. "I'm not interested in arrangements I can't account for." He was quiet for a moment. Cale, she would learn, did everything at his own pace, and found waiting to be other people's problem. "You work for me," he said. "Financial oversight of the legitimate holdings. You report to no one except me, and you flag anything that looks like what you found tonight. In return, your student debt disappears, and you receive a monthly retainer that is clean, documented, and will survive any audit you care to run." She thought about the thermos she carried, because vending machine pretzels were $3. She thought about the loan payments and the cleaning shifts and the particular exhaustion of being destroyed once for doing the right thing. "I want my own desk," she said, "and I don't work past midnight." 10 o'clock, he said. "After that, I need you functional." She wasn't sure what that meant. She nodded. The work was genuine and demanding, and Fiona was good at it. The legitimate side of Harrow Atlantic had been structured for concealment rather than accuracy for years, and the resulting architecture was unstable in ways that had nothing to do with the criminal operation. She spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but mapping the real shape of the thing underneath the shape it was pretending to be. Paper and pencil. Because paper didn't autocorrect, and autocorrect had once cost her a decimal point she couldn't afford. Cale came to her desk on the Wednesday of her second week. He stood at a slight distance. She noticed he always kept a slight distance, as though proximity required deliberate management, and looked at her notebook. "You work in paper first," he said. "Paper doesn't have an undo function." He said nothing. He looked at the note she had written in the corner. "Check Fenwick subaccount, Q3 gap." "The Fenwick account is legitimate," he said. "The account is. The Q3 gap in the reporting isn't. Someone missed a filing date by 11 days and backdated the correction. If Srey looks at the timestamped metadata, it flags." He was quiet. "Fix it." "I can't fix a backdated filing. I can file an amended return with a disclosure note and a reasonable explanation. It will attract scrutiny. It won't attract suspicion. Suspicion is worse than scrutiny." He looked at her. "Most people I work with don't distinguish between those. Most people you work with aren't accountants." That almost made him smile. It was a very contained face, and she was still learning to read it. She had also noticed that Cale did not eat. She noticed because she was good at noticing things people were trying not to show. He drank coffee. He drank water. Once, on a Thursday afternoon, she watched him eat 3 crackers from a sleeve, and then stop, not from satisfaction, but from the visible effort of will. The men around him registered nothing. She understood. You did not comment on the temperature in a room set by a man like Cale. On the Friday of her second week, she brought 2 thermoses. She set one on her desk. She placed the other in the middle of the small conference table, where they reviewed the week's numbers on Friday afternoons. "That's not mine," he said. "Lentil soup, water, dried lentils, an onion, salt. I made too much." He looked at it the way he had looked at the first thermos, that same careful, measured approach, the breath before the first sip. He drank it while she walked him through the week's amended filings. He asked 2 questions about the Fenwick amendment. He did not thank her. He finished the soups and set the empty thermos aside, and she pretended she hadn't been watching. She started bringing 2 thermoses on Wednesdays as well. Then most days, because she had begun to understand that what was happening in his body required consistency, the way a damaged account required consistency. The same careful attention, repeated until trust accumulated and the record corrected itself. She didn't comment on his eating. He didn't comment on her bringing it. That was their arrangement. What he did was stay later on the evenings she was working, not hovering, working at his own desk on the other side of the glass partition, asking questions when questions arose, and otherwise existing in the same space with a stillness that reminded her of what it was like to work alone in a room where someone you trusted was also present. She hadn't had that feeling in a long time. The meals changed the way the accounts changed. Lentil soup to soft-cooked eggs on plain toast, toast to potato and leek chowder with nothing heavy in it. By the 3rd week, color was returning to his face. By the 4th, she heard Holt on the phone with a tailor. She said nothing about any of it. He said nothing about any of it. Some things are better left in the category of understood rather than documented. One Thursday evening in December, he appeared at the edge of her desk and said, without opening remarks of any kind, "The firm that fired you, they're in difficulty." Fiona kept her eyes on the page. "I heard. The client you flagged is under investigation. The firm cooperated by producing records, including records of your internal report. Your termination is documented as retaliatory suppression. There's a case if you want one. I know a barrister." She set her pen down carefully. "Is that a transaction or a favor?" "What's the difference?" "Transactions I can price. Favors have flexible rates." He considered this. "Consider it a transaction. You found something that would have cost me considerably. The referral costs me nothing. The accounting is straightforward." She picked up her pen. "Fine." "Fine," he said, and went back to his desk. She stared at her records for a moment. She had stopped trying to categorize the particular tone of his voice when he used certain words. It wasn't productive. The threat arrived in the second week of December, and it arrived in the language she spoke best. She was at her desk at 8 in the evening, working through a holding structure spread across 3 shell entities, when she found the transfer. Clean, legitimate-looking, properly documented on the surface. A significant block of assets moving from one of Cale's holding companies into a joint account with a numbered company. She traced the numbered company 2 layers back. The beneficial owner was a man named Driscoll. She sat very still. She traced backwards further, a second transfer, a third, 4 total, each stage just below the automatic reporting threshold, each within a 15-day window. When they completed, Cale's largest legitimate holding would be encumbered by a joint ownership claim from a Driscoll-controlled entity. The claim would trigger a legal dispute. The dispute would attract regulatory scrutiny at the precise moment an anonymous CRA tip arrived. She could see the preparation for the tip buried in a communications log she had access to only because she had spent 6 weeks building her own index of the system's architecture. It was the same mind that had built the original discrepancy. Patient, structural, designed to look like paperwork instead of warfare. She printed everything. She organized it into one set. She stood up, walked to the glass partition, and knocked once. Cale looked up from his desk. "I need you to look at something," she said. Her voice was steady. She had been afraid of large and powerful things for over a year now, and she was very tired of it. He read what she gave him. Twice, 4 minutes of silence, and then he looked up. 11 days, she said, before the first transfer completes and triggers the claim. I can file challenges on the underlying documents. There's a procedural defect in how the joint account was structured. It was done in haste, but I need full system access and I need to start tonight. He looked at her with something deep and unresolved moving in his expression. "It's Driscoll," he said. "I assumed. He knows you're here." "He knows I found the original discrepancy," Fiona said. "He built this to be found late enough to matter. He miscalculated how quickly I read." Holt, who had appeared silently in the doorway, exhaled through his nose. Cale stood up. He buttoned his jacket with the automatic precision of a man for whom the gesture was armor. He looked at her desk, at the lamp she had left on, at the thermos from the afternoon sitting cold beside her monitor. "What do you need?" he said. She told him. "System access levels, a backup authentication code, someone available to countersign a CRA correction filing at 6 in the morning, and coffee, because she was going to be at this for most of the night and the thermos was cold." He produced all 4 without comment. Holt sourced the coffee and said nothing about the particular strangeness of fetching coffee at 9 in the evening for a woman doing forensic accounting in an office that most people never saw the inside of. She worked. Cale stayed. He did not hover. He sat in the leather chair across from her desk and read from a file and asked questions when the work overlapped, and they existed in the quiet of 2 people who had stopped performing for each other sometime in the past 6 weeks without either of them deciding to. At 2:20 in the morning, she set her pen down. "The challenge filings are in," she said. "The procedural defect is documented and flagged with the registrar. The CRA tip route is blocked. I found the account they were going to use and filed a fraud alert against it. Driscoll would need to begin completely over. He's out of time." Cale set down his file. "It's done," she said. She was very tired. Her back hurt, and her hands were stiff, and the fluorescent light had given her a headache that lived directly behind her left eye. "Your holdings are intact." He stood up. He walked to her desk and looked at the printed records she had laid out in sequence, the paper map of what had been built against him and what she had dismantled. "You knew when you found it what it meant that he knew about you," he said. "Yes. You stayed. Your accounts aren't going to file themselves." She paused. The honest answer was pushing to come out. the way honest answers did after midnight when she had stopped managing herself, and I was fired once for finding something I should have reported. I wasn't leaving a second time. The office was very quiet. December dark outside the window, the harbour lights dim and cold through the glass. Cale crossed to the small table and picked up the thermos. He looked at it the way he always looked at it. That internal accounting look, the look of a man trying to tally something that doesn't have a column. "When I hired you," he said, "I told you it was a transaction, your skills for compensation. Clean, documented, straightforward. You did." That wasn't entirely accurate. He set the thermos down. He turned to look at her, and the grey eyes had something in them she had no category for and had stopped trying to file. "What you have provided is not a service I can put a number to. Not anymore." Fiona was an accountant. She thought in reconciliations, in things that had to balance. What he was describing did not balance. It was a liability that had become an asset through a mechanism she could not document. And she had no framework for it, and she was 31 years old and tired, and had spent too long running on fumes to pretend she did not understand what he meant. "I need you to stop," Cale said, treating this like an employment arrangement. "Then what is it?" He was quiet. The clock on her desk read 2:41. "Whatever you need it to be," he said, "in order to stay." She looked at him. She looked at the stack of documents she had built through the night, the 6 hours of work she had chosen to do without being asked. She looked at the cold thermos and thought about the one she had packed that morning, the second one she still hadn't opened. She reached into her bag and took it out. She poured 2 cups. She pushed one across the desk. He sat down opposite her. He picked up the cup. "Chicken and barley," she said. "My grandmother made it every Sunday in winter. She said it was the only thing worth eating when the weather turned." He drank. She drank. Halifax outside the glass was dark and cold and entirely indifferent, the way the Atlantic is indifferent, the way cities are indifferent to the small and quiet things that happen in offices above them in the middle of the night. Inside, there were 2 thermoses and a lamp and 6 weeks of accumulated understanding that neither of them had named, and both of them had been carrying. Cale set down his empty cup. He looked at her with that expression she had stopped trying to categorize, and she thought, not for the first time, that the most precise ledgers are the ones that cannot be written down. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want to go through the Fenwick Amendment again. There's a second gap." "I didn't miss it," she said. "I flagged it on page 4. You didn't read far enough." The corner of his mouth moved. She poured him a second cup. Outside, the harbour was still and cold. Inside, a man who had spent 6 months unable to accept anything, was sitting across from a woman who had spent 14 months being unable to give anything, and they were both for the first time in a long time, neither of those things. Some accounts, Fiona thought, balance themselves.